Welcome back, everybody. It's 7 a.m. here in Singapore, 8 a.m. in Tokyo. Let's bring you today's headlines. G20 finance ministers raising the risk of intensified trade and geopolitical tensions, but stopping short of calling for a resolution of the US-China trade conflict.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin telling me that Huawei could be part of a trade deal between China and the United States, but insists that these issues are separate.
I think what the president is saying is if we move forward on trade, that perhaps he'll be willing to do certain things on Huawei if he gets comfort from China on that and certain guarantees. But these are national security issues that we will want to make sure are resolved one way or another.
And a mega deal in the aviation space. United Technologies agreeing to merge its aerospace business with US defense contractor Raytheon in the industry's biggest ever merger. Right, so Japan starts trade at the top of the hour, and this is what the market did in the Friday session. Previous close, reasonably constructive, so we're nudging closer towards 21,000, and look for some gains today, given the fact that we are keying off a strong Wall Street close on Friday. Paradoxically, we got that underwhelming payrolls number, but the market's view is that, look, this is bad news, so that means that bad economic news is going to make the Fed think that perhaps they have to start to consider a rate cut. Hooray! So cheaper money stays around for longer, which is what the stock market's like. Topic's previous close, 1,532. Dollar yen is looking pretty constructive at 108.45 dollar yen. Right, New Zealand's been open for an hour and is currently trading like this. A little bit of traction, not a lot. We're not shooting lights out, but holding the line for the S&P NZX 50 index above that 10,000 handle. Kiwi dollar is underwater just by a tad, 66.54, and the Kiwi dollar against its Australian counterpart, 95.13, is where we are standing. Aussie markets, by the way, will remain shut today for the Queen's birthday. God bless her, Tanvir.
Oh, yes, indeed.
She has two birthdays, you know.
Really?
Yeah, she has her regular birthday and she has an official birthday as well.
Oh, that's very interesting. We should talk about that in detail. I'm very fond and a big fan of the Queen. U.S. Treasury Secretary, and let's just move on, Steven Mnuchin meeting with the PBOC Governor Yi Gang at the G20 finance ministers meeting. Mnuchin saying they held constructive and candid talks. It was the first high-level meeting since the trade talks between the U.S. and China hit an impasse. Mnuchin also saying that Trump will meet with President Xi Jinping at the G20 leaders meeting in Osaka, and he did raise the prospects of easing restrictions on Huawei. So really covering a wide range of issues out there in that exclusive chat with my colleague Nancy Hungerford, who joins us live from Fukuoka, Japan right now. Nancy, like I said, he pretty much gave out all the headlines that you were seeking from that interview, but he stopped short of making any firm commitments from what one can expect at the G20.
Yep. That's right, Tanvir. And the Treasury Secretary also wouldn't tell me what exactly was the reason for the breakdown in talks previously. And that's critical because, as you mentioned, this was the first high-level conversation we've had between U.S. and Chinese officials in that meeting with Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin and the PBOC Governor Yi Gang. They had already played down expectations that any negotiations would take place behind closed doors because, remember, the PBOC Governor is not a key player in those negotiations. He hasn't been party to them. So they are just talking about the relationship going forward and elements such as the currency, which we talked about previously. But it is significant that the Treasury Secretary also has confirmed that President Trump and President Xi will be meeting in just a few weeks now in Osaka. And now the question becomes, what do they need to achieve in those talks in order to avoid those tariffs going on some $300 billion worth of Chinese goods into the United States, because that is what has everyone so concerned, not just here in Fukuoka when you talk about finance ministers globally, but investors. When you look at the market anxiety, they are very worried about what those additional tariffs could mean for the U.S. economy at a time when the U.S. economy is already looking more fragile. Just look at the non-farms number we had out on Friday. So this will be the big issue. And Secretary Mnuchin did seem to suggest that as long as the two sides have constructive talks, as long as they agree that they are moving forward on the same terms, they don't necessarily need to sign a deal to avoid those tariffs. But then there's this issue of technology. It's not just about trade terms anymore. And so I did have a chance to ask him about Huawei. And I asked him whether or not, from the Chinese side, they don't just see this as potentially part of a deal, as to whether or not they may see it as conditional that the U.S. changes their stance, especially that move they made to blacklist Huawei before the two parties move forward on talks. Take a listen to what he had to say about that.
The Huawei discussions are really national security discussions. They're separate from trade. Both we and China have acknowledged that in our discussions. Now, of course, President Trump, when he has the meeting, to the extent he gets certain comfort on Huawei or other issues, obviously we can talk about national security issues, but these are separate issues. They're not being linked to trade.
The president has said they could be linked.
Well, I think what the president is saying is if we move forward on trade, that perhaps he'll be willing to do certain things on Huawei if he gets comfort from China on that and certain guarantees. But these are national security issues that we will want to make sure are resolved one way or another.
And given that these lines are being blurred so frequently now between trade and national security, how difficult does that make your job?
Well, I'm involved in the national security issues as well, since I sit on the Security Council. I think you know we manage all the sanctions in Treasury, so I'm actively involved in these discussions.
Do you get pushback from Secretary of State, from the Defense Department, not to give in on a deal too easily because the security concerns are so extreme at this time? I
think we have an excellent relationship with Secretary Pompeo and with the other agencies. We consult with each other regularly, and this is a unified team under President Trump's direction. Do
you think the government will look to sanction Hikvision, which is the surveillance camera company?
I obviously am not going to comment on any specific sanctions that we may or may not do in the future.
And that was the U.S. Treasury Secretary really trying to draw a line between national security issues and the trade and investment issues that he is overseeing these negotiations with China. But he himself made it clear that this is very tricky to separate the two. He consults regularly with the Defense Department, with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and although he's saying those relations are strong and very good at this moment, that presents the challenge, Shri, when we talk about whether or not China and the U.S. can move forward on a substantial deal, because it is those technology issues, and technology is so susceptible to national security concerns. So given that reality, I'm not so sure you can separate these with a clean line. And the reason I asked about whether or not the U.S. was looking to sanction Hikvision, which is that surveillance camera company, as you know very well, the U.S. has already raised concerns about that company and how it is surveying the Uyghur population. And this gets into the area of the human rights issues that the U.S. administration has now presented. And I have a feeling that Chinese President Xi Jinping will want to address this at that G20 meeting in Osaka with President Trump. They'll have some concerns about these two issues being tacked on to those of trade and investment. Shri?
I'll say that's putting it lightly, Nancy. You're quite right. And China, for one, and we know this very clearly, does not want to be pushed around on issues concerning its internal security and in internal matters, especially the Uyghur issue, and not least of all as well, Taiwan as well, which could be the next issue to crop up perhaps next year. With the presidential elections. Nancy, thank you for that. Let's move on. The trade disputes between China and the US could heat up further as China's state media reports that Beijing is creating a system to protect its technology. Eunice Yoon has more from Beijing. Eunice, talk about raising the Great Firewall of China. Beijing is basically saying, hey, we can be protectionist too.
Yeah, that's right. But I thought what you and Nancy were talking about was really interesting because from the Chinese side, China has not yet confirmed that President Xi Jinping is going to be meeting with President Trump. And I would suspect that there is a lot of calculating going on and assessing exactly what the risk would be for President Xi Jinping to meet with President Trump and what the risk would be if they decided not to. Because you have to remember that the Chinese want to present themselves as the grown-up in the room, so that would suggest that China would want to have that meeting. At the same time, we've seen what happened with Mexico. President Trump and with North Korea, President Trump could make a decision that the Chinese side might think could be potentially embarrassing for President Xi Jinping. So this is something that we're going to be watching today, especially later in the day, Sri, when the Ministry of Foreign Affairs holds its meeting. But as you had said, there is a lot of hostility on all sorts of fronts. You mentioned Taiwan. You mentioned the Uyghur crisis, which the U.S. State Department has described as China's atrocities. And now, so we see that the U.S. is continuously poking China in the eye. And meanwhile, China has said that they are going to restrict potentially exports of their own sensitive technology. And Sri, there have also been reports that the Chinese have been threatening U.S. tech firms as well if they decide to abide by the Trump administration's ban on Huawei. Very difficult to see U.S. companies deciding not to abide with this U.S. directive, but Sri, it's going to be very interesting to see what the Chinese response is later today.
And very interesting to see if there is a landmark deal at the end of this month at G20, considering the atmospherics, as you said, Eunice, are just so bad at the moment. Thank you very much indeed for that, Eunice. We'll check in with you later on in the programme. In the meantime, coming up, a strategy session. As we kick off a new trading day in Asia, we'll ask our next guest when he thinks the best buying opportunity is. As we head for a break, here's a look at US Treasuries right now. We'll be back in 2.
Good morning, Mrs. Wong.
Good morning, your favorite.
Thank you. Good morning, Mrs. Wong.
Good morning. Look what I made for you.
Thank you. Mrs. Wong? Help! Help!
Good thing your grandson was around when you had your fall, Mrs. Wong.